The 1990s were a time often regarded by many people, even contemporaries, as the end of history. Now, that's a very weird, controversial description. What does it even mean? Well, it is an observation that stems from the political and socio-economic factors of the time that produced a much more alternative, carefree culture. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man from 1992 even shares this exact sentiment. In the 90s, you had the end of the Cold War, an economic boom, and all kinds of people from all around the world instantly connected to one another thanks to something called the internet. Relative to the rest of the century, heck, the rest of history, it felt like humanity finally figured things out. Now, obviously, the 90s were not the end of history. This feeling, shared by many people at the time, was a fad and nothing more. And of course, fads come and go. And this attitude certainly manifested into the cultural trends of the time, especially technological ones, as it was clear that computers and the internet were here to stay for good. With the year 2000 creeping up, the future was just around the corner. This was only the beginning of something incredible. And with our retrospective knowledge, we can now reflect on these tech trends that have since been forgotten, and how their absence only hammers in how much things have changed. Now, the first trend from this period that really stands out is see-through electronics. You had transparent phones, computers, Game Boys, and so on. It is important to keep in mind that the 1990s were essentially the bridge between the modern world that we recognize today and the archaic vintage world of the 20th century. So naturally, this was a decade which encompassed the customs of both. As a result, you get the over-materialization of new technologies specifically intended for a new virtual world, such as computers and the internet. It is really the only way to get people to easily migrate over to this new way of experiencing the world. But not only that, it must be appealing. The best way to showcase that this was the future was to constantly remind the user that. Much like in the 1950s, the environment of this time produced a culture that embraced this sort of idealized, polished, and glossy depiction of the future, what we now call retrofuturism. This was, of course, motivated by the whole concept of making things futuristic to celebrate the new millennium. Because yes, even with the Y2K panic still floating around in the tech world, the optimism for the future was still quite present. Heck, it wasn't even just technology. You had things like Clear Pepsi pop up. It was a trend that made transparency synonymous with the future. But it should also be noted that this was a trend that appeared much more towards the middle and end of the 90s. In fact, computers for a portion of the decade were arguably quite the opposite of appealing. Now, home computers garnered popularity based on their capability alone, but they were still very big, boxy, beige utilitarian machines. They were ugly. It looked like something designed for a professional work setting that required extensive training to use it properly. Consequently, many people still found computers very intimidating at this time. It was around 1998 where someone came up with the idea of bringing the trend of the transparent phone and TV sets over to the computer, and it was Apple. They released the iMac, which was the antithesis of these beige boxes. It was see-through, curvy, colorful. It looked like something out of the Jetsons. Additionally, it was specifically designed to make going on the internet easy. In fact, the I in iMac stood for internet. It felt like a computer for everyday people, by everyday people. Its popularity only strengthened this trend, which would even last quite a bit throughout the 2000s as well, manifesting through things like Frutiger Aero and other derivative styles. This transparency not only represented the transparency of the internet, which envisioned a world of keeping users informed with very little ambiguity, it allowed you to see the inner workings of these incredible machines to appreciate how far humanity had come. The fact that you could choose your own iMac color symbolized the concept of people having a new sense of agency in this virtual realm. They could pick and choose how they wanted their online world to look. And this sentiment certainly branched over into software as well. Although technologically limited compared to now, the static web pages of the early World Wide Web were designed specifically with boundless customizability in mind. Virtually anything was possible within the two-dimensional space. The only limit was the screen. This was further made possible by just how homogenized the computer experience was at the time. The vast majority of machines ran Microsoft Windows on monitors that were often the same dimensions, often on even the same web browser. Because most people were using the same thing, much of the internet was designed for this specific setup as it grew more advanced, which significantly decreased the probability of compatibility issues. Things like JavaScript and cascading style sheets often worked just fine on these platforms and gave the creator virtually full say in what their web page looked like. They could do things like change their page's colors, add cool fonts, animated images, and even sound effects. These capabilities were then broadened even further with things like Flash Player. Now your website could almost look like a video game, beyond just images and text. It was a world within another world. This type of setup gave the internet a very upbeat, almost cartoony style. Many websites were quite flamboyant and goofy looking, even ones for professional settings like corporations or even government agencies. Because of how new the internet was, there wasn't really as strict of a rulebook for how things should be formatted on a web page. As platforms like Windows only continued to grow in popularity, this trend only grew stronger throughout the 2000s. You then have things like customizable MySpace pages and YouTube channels, which also gave users the ability to write their own CSS code to make their pages look how they envisioned it. But then as smartphones entered the picture and eventually even superseded home computers in market share, and as software diversity increased, support for pages like this got more difficult. A CSS MySpace page just doesn't look as good on a small mobile screen, and certain operating systems and web browsers may load web pages differently. And as the internet got older and people got more familiar with it, rules for web design etiquette changed to be much more professional. But the 90s showed us a time where things were much more decentralized and where these kinds of decisions were up to the individual.
He's back, and he's taking the World Wide Web by storm. Sane Posewell, featuring his most ambitious project yet, Boot.dev.
I always thought I was born too late to be an explorer. There's actually a whole other world out there. It's in my bedroom, inside my computer. Where'd all the files go? Boot.dev not only teaches back-end web development through Python and Go from start to finish, it makes learning fun. I wasn't like other kids. I was always interested in what bark was made of on a tree. Was never good at math. I just had to cruise through life on my good looks and versatility. Those programmers who did the 2000 switch are this next generation's policemen. They're like real-life superheroes. And Boot.dev makes their craft both hands-on and easy to understand. I'm actually building projects on my own and earning XP points while I do it. It's never boring. Bill Gates is a real hero of mine. The work he's created, I'm actually not sure what he does, but the fact that he's doing it, I respect that. Thanks to Boot.dev, an ordinary guy like me can create something with computer code and cement my place into cyber history. I don't have to be afraid anymore.
Users who choose the manual plan and use code NationSquid at checkout will get 25% off their entire first year. Take your piece of the web and join Boot.dev to become a programmer.
But do keep in mind, the internet also wasn't nearly as accessible as it is now. Computers were not only new, but they were expensive. And someone who has never really gotten the chance to experience the internet firsthand wasn't as likely to be incentivized into buying one. So, a middle ground was met on this issue. You could familiarize yourself with the internet, give it a test drive, if you will, at something called an internet cafe. Think of a library and a coffee shop put together. You could walk in, order a cup of coffee and a sandwich, and then sit at a computer where you could now explore this new world and see how it makes you feel. It was the perfect kind of setup because, although it was certainly a utility, the internet at this time was more seen as a recreational novelty, a more social pastime. It only made sense for these types of machines to exist in a very social setting. And so, internet cafes blew up and started popping up left and right. Rather than spending $20 a month on an AOL subscription, you could spend around 16 cents a minute to just explore it for a short amount of time while you enjoy a nice pastry. But you know what else was new at this time, along with the internet? Coffee. Let me explain. Obviously, as far back as you can even remember, you could always just walk into a diner or a drugstore and order a nice hot cup of joe. But coffee, specifically the practice of ordering coffee, became much more exotic in the 90s. As opposed to just ordering black, ordering a decaf soy latte with a shot of peppermint was the new hip thing to do. This was around the time Starbucks became popular, where its target demographic was upper class, almost snobbish people with very choosy tastes, further reflecting that sense of user choice that the internet had at this time. And by combining these two new things, it created a whole new subculture and gave people another reason to be excited and to try something new. Of course, almost everyone today has a computer or smartphone on them and can just bring their laptop to Starbucks. So there wasn't really a need for internet cafes anymore. And so they died out. They have since transformed into gaming cafes where people can test drive certain video games before deciding to buy them. While internet cafes may not exist in the same manner, they helped establish a tone for the World Wide Web for the years to come. This over-materialization of computers also extended to software. As we discussed, the best way to bring someone over to the virtual world is to do so through mediums that are much more physical, something they are already familiar with. And so, the internet was sold on disks and floppies. Obviously, you still needed a modem. The connection didn't just show up through magic. But these disks provided the software that made the connection possible in the first place. While it's not like ISPs in the 90s had any choice outside of providing their software on physical media because, well, that was really the only technology that was possible at the time, marketing it with this user familiarity in mind certainly worked in their favor. Much like internet cafes, these disks could also be used to entice indecisive people who were trying the internet for the first time. Remember that during the early days of the internet, ISPs charged access by the hour or even by the minute, much like a phone. Because of this, you could often go to the store and buy a prepaid internet plan on disk, offering up to 500 hours of online access. And when that time ran out and you still were a bit indecisive and wanted to try it again, you would just get another disk and another one after that. Additionally, AOL also gave out free trial CDs at places like Blockbuster Video as part of their brand marketing. It was a loss leader that got their name out to the public. So over time, people just kind of hoarded AOL starter disks. It wasn't uncommon for computer workstations to be just filled and stacked with internet paraphernalia. There are even some accounts of people hanging up these disks on their walls when they were done using them, almost like artwork. In fact, at one point, nearly half of all CDs ever produced had an AOL logo on them. However, in December of 1996, AOL made the revolutionary decision of offering unlimited access to the internet for a flat monthly rate of just $19.95. So the subscription model for internet access quickly became the industry standard. Trial disks continued to exist for some time after that, but this initial business model allowed for people to view the internet as something tangible. Much like how a vinyl record gives a special artistic quality to music beyond just through sound, these internet starter disks humorously kind of did the same thing to celebrate a new, incredible technology. As we've talked about, because the internet in the 90s had so much open real estate and still needed more people to get on it, it also lacked a lot of regulation. Arguably one of the biggest online fads to appear at the turn of the millennium was decentralized file sharing, aka piracy. It all started with a company known as Napster, which allowed users to download music online for free, using something known as peer-to-peer technology. This was a groundbreaking method for downloading files, especially during the time of slow 90s internet. Hosting tens of thousands of songs all on one website was not only incredibly expensive for a small company like Napster, but also very easy to shut down if a copyright holder wanted to. Instead, if you downloaded a song, rather than downloading it from Napster's web servers, you would instead download it from another Napster user who had that file on their computer. And that could be hundreds of Napster users. This was so much more cost efficient for the company and allowed users to get the files they wanted. Everybody wins. To listen to your music, you could download a program known as Winamp, which even allowed you to customize it with your own program skin that you could create or download off the internet. It was another shining example of embracing user customizability in the virtual space. Not to mention, it also took up much less resources than something like Windows Media Player. And so, peer-to-peer programs started quickly popping up, such as LimeWire, Kazaa, and then an entirely separate, improved version of the protocol known as Gnutella. Naturally, this type of file sharing became super popular, a little too popular for its own good. The distribution of copyrighted material got so out of hand, it led to one of the first major instances in which the internet was brought into real-life application. Numerous copyright lawsuits and legal cases eventually brought Napster's services down. And because of things like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998, there was now a legal precedent for how material should be distributed online, and effectively gave companies a blueprint for how they could make a profit. To no surprise, these decisions were super controversial, and decentralized file sharing only continued to grow and become more innovative, even if it was much less public now. You then have things like BitTorrent appear, which increase the capability of file sharing and even what kind of files could be shared by orders of magnitude. While many of these trends have gone through major transformations or have even disappeared entirely, it is because of them the internet is the way that it is now. Whether that is for better or for worse is, of course, up to the individual. Because with the internet, wasn't that always the case? I have done a whole separate video about the entire history of the internet in pretty intricate detail, which you can find right here. A special thanks to all my Patreon supporters and channel members down below, patreon.com/nationsquid. And if you'd like, buying me a coffee is very much appreciated as well. Thank you for watching.